In 1985, a team of researchers was absolutely glued to their screens because they were seeing something remarkable. They'd just rediscovered the wreck of Titanic, lost for over 7 decades at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Their cameras found the bow of the ship beautifully intact, sitting incredibly upright on the sea floor after a 12,500 foot, nearly 4,000 kilometre drop straight down, and they swept along the hull, which rose up like a cliff face from the ocean floor. But then it just kind of, stopped. There came a sudden realization. The passenger reports that the ship had broken apart during the sinking were actually true. Now, we've done a video covering the breakup before. More passengers said the ship broke up than those that didn't. But it was still a stunning revelation. It meant the stern section was still somewhere out there, just waiting to be found. Amazingly, it was discovered resting some 2,600 feet, nearly 800 meters away. And oh boy, what a mess. The stern section was in a shocking state of destruction, and expedition members were awed by the level of damage. It looked, many have said since, as if a giant bomb had gone off. What happened to Titanic's stern? Why is the ship in 2 pieces? One beautifully frozen in time, the other a shattered, empty husk. All kinds of theories have been put forward, from implosion to even the idea of the devastating explosion of goods stored on board. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and today we're going to deep dive, pun intended, into the physics behind what happened to Titanic's stern section. This wreck footage from RMS Titanic Inc. gives us a remarkable view of Titanic as she sits on the sea floor. Particularly interesting is all this damage to the stern. Up close, it can very often be hard to tell what you're even looking at. It looks like bent and folded cardboard, but this is steel plating an inch thick in some places. There are popped rivets in their thousands, twisted frames made of solid steel. What on earth happened here? Well, Dr. Robert Ballard and the research team back in 1985 asked themselves the exact same question. Now, viewing things up close like this, it's really difficult to get a picture of what the whole stern section actually even looks like. Now, back then, there weren't any fancy side scans, sonar imagery, or the techniques like we have today. The stern had to be recreated the old-fashioned way, by hand, and fortunately, they had just the man to do it. Artist Ken Marschall was called in to refer to the hundreds of tiny photos of the stern section and to paint what it might look down there in its entirety. The results were shocking. His paintings of the wreck have been published in books and magazines around the world. Arguably, it's his painting of the stern section which captures the imagination the most. So what happened to the ship to cause all of this? Well, to begin with, we need to wind the clock back to the early hours of April 15th, 1912, when the Titanic was in her final death throes. The ship's bow had sunk far below the ocean's surface, and the stern was rising higher and higher into the air. With the lights still burning, although dimmed, as the ship's machinery struggled to work under the onerous conditions, the ship's 3 bronze propellers and about 25,000 tons of stern section towered above the heads of survivors, and then, with a snap, the lights went out, and the ship began to tear itself apart, breaking around the region of the 3rd funnel. We looked closely at this and other ships which have broken apart in another video and concluded that the breakup would probably have been quite clean, not unlike that of the RMS Magdalena here. And what happened next is up for some debate. Whether the stern was pulled down or sank under the massive weight of its own engines, more than 1,300 tons of iron and steel at the very forward exposed end of the breakup zone. Either way, survivors watched on as the stern pulled back up to the near vertical and then slipped beneath the waves. Somewhere along the way, from the surface of the ocean to the sea floor 12,500 feet down, Titanic's stern was horribly, horribly disfigured. So what happened? Well, there's a few things we need to consider. The first explanation often offered for this is one that has been very much more on the public radar since June 2023. And that is the theory of an implosion. Now, the theory that Titanic's stern imploded violently can trace its origins back to director and underwater explorer James Cameron. Now, we all know him as the driving force behind the 1997 film, but Cameron also has some serious underwater chops, having dived the wreck many times and seen the damage and destruction up close and personal. Through the years, he's analysed his findings and the footage captured from the wreck to piece together the puzzle of the ship's final moments, and these have been presented many times in documentaries for National Geographic and others. In 2012, it was time for Cameron to do it for the last time, putting together a team of experts to analyse the wreck to find out what had happened. In the animation they put together, they show Titanic's stern slip beneath the waves before, boom, it implodes, causing massive damage. The theory is that Titanic's stern section, unlike the bow, flooded and sank in a very, very short amount of time at the end there. It meant that there was air still left trapped inside, and that once the stern had sunk down to 200 or 300 feet, the water pressure caused the stern structure to fail along the hull, resulting in an enormous boom that blasted it apart. The only issue is this is highly unlikely to have actually happened. But before we go into why, we need to understand what an implosion actually is. It sounds self-explanatory, but there's actually a few physics things in there that really convolute things. First, we all understand the concept of water pressure, that the deeper down you go, the more pressure there is. You can think of it simply as the weight of water. The deeper down you go, the more water there is simply above you pressing down. It's a linear scale. That is, the water pressure increases at the same rate with depth, about one of Earth's atmospheres for every 10 meters or 33 feet. It means that at the bottom of some of the deepest parts of the ocean, the pressure can exceed 1,000 atmospheres. Now, this is equivalent to the weight of 2 SUV cars pressing down on every square inch of your body. Ouch. Now, what these kinds of pressures can do to man-made structures was dramatically and tragically demonstrated in mid-2023 when the submersible Titan catastrophically failed above the wreck of the Titanic. Now, this was caused most likely by the failure of the carbon fiber pressure hull of the submersible, thanks to a little thing called pressure differential. Now, this is a state where there's significant difference between the pressure outside of a hollow object versus inside that object. Essentially, the greater pressure outside will act to push the hollow structure in on itself, crushing it like you might crush a tin can in your hands. Now, for a structure to experience a pressure differential great enough to cause an implosion, it needs to be like the submersible Titan, watertight, obviously, but also airtight. If there's no way for the air to get out and the water to get in, then the pressure builds alarmingly. Eventually, there comes a breaking point and a critical failure occurs. The structure blasts inwards on itself, the air inside being completely compressed rapidly, briefly hitting massive temperatures. Now, the reason air heats as it compresses is because the molecules are forced closer together and bounce off one another like little rubber balls, faster and faster, all the while with more energy. This is called adiabatic compression, and it happens all in a fraction of a second, of course. So in short, for conditions to actually cause an implosion on a structure, we need a sealed, airtight container. If the container wasn't watertight or airtight, then it would partially flood inside, but the air above could compress to a point where the pressure differential would equalize. There couldn't be an implosion because the air would be pushing back with the same force as the water pressing in on it. So now we need to apply all this to Titanic. As the ship's stern is pulled underwater, suddenly all the trapped air inside is rushing out with extreme force being replaced inside by the ocean itself. Now, air pockets in ships are a thing. They can form where air becomes trapped, say, in awkward corners or sealed compartments like refrigeration units. Now, does this mean Titanic could have made it hundreds or even thousands of feet down with air pockets still trapped inside? Well, yeah. I mean, it's a pretty scary thought, actually. Some people have survived being in air pockets for days. In May 2013, a chef spent 60 hours in an air pocket about 100 feet below the surface in a sunken ship. Now, Titanic did have refrigerators and some cold insulated storage deep down in her stern section. Now, Cameron and his team would tell us that enough air was trapped in Titanic's stern section that as it passed 200 or 300 feet of depth, it suddenly and catastrophically imploded, similar to the Titan Submersible. Except that other ships have sunk at similar speeds to Titanic, but not suffered implosion damage to the scale that ship is supposed to have. For example, the wreck of Lusitania, the ship sank in only 20 or so minutes, Although today it's in a shocking state of disrepair, there's actually no discernible evidence of implosion. The same's true of the sister ship of Titanic, Britannic. She's in remarkable condition. On Lusitania, you'd expect plating and bulkheads to be buckled inward under the extreme outside pressure. Remember that little thing called pressure differential we were talking about? But there's nothing like that, and there's really nothing like that down on Titanic either. Shell plating and bits of the ship have clearly been ripped away, but it doesn't seem like it collapsed in on itself. None of the plating is buckled or pressed inwards. Instead, it's been blasted away. We also have to think about why an implosion would be unlikely because of the way the ship was actually built. Remember, we said we need correct conditions for an implosion, airtight and watertight compartments or pockets within the ship's hull, but Titanic had very, very few true air or watertight spaces. Virtually every compartment within the ship had to be ventilated to allow fresh air in and out, even the refrigeration and storage compartments. Enclosed voids in ships with no ventilation at all are an enormous risk to life. You could easily get overwhelmed by gases or carbon dioxide and die. Designers go out of their way to remove this risk as much as possible with ventilation. Not only that, but Titanic's stern section was made up of dozens and dozens of staterooms and cabins, separated only by timber planked walls, not metal bulkheads, as you'd imagine. There's very little down there that would be able to withstand the forces of water pressure to even build air pockets. Cameron and his team show the stern section acting like a single structure, falling in one go. So we need to look at the stern itself and ask if it meets the conditions of air and water tightness. Well, after being broken apart and ripped apart at one end, it obviously doesn't. There was plenty of opportunity for air to escape en masse as it was forced out by the ocean. One way is the hundreds of portholes along the ship's side. We know from passenger testimonies that Titanic's third-class accommodations were uncomfortably warm on the night of the sinking, and passengers weren't able to control their in-stateroom heat with thermostats like we might today. Now, to account for this, many might have opened their portholes to allow the cool air in. With dozens of portholes possibly open, the air trapped within Titanic's stern could have been pushed out under force as the ship sank. There were other escape routes too. Every stateroom, cabin, and public room was fed fresh air by a complicated system of ducts and trunking, which led down into the ship from up on the top decks. Even the fourth funnel, that was torn off during the sinking, but its stories-deep shaft led right down into the turbine room and opened it up to the sky. There are also 4 cargo hatches on the stern section, each topped only with a relatively flimsy cover that displaced air under pressure from below could easily pop off. Even given the rapid final plunge of the stern section, it's unlikely that large amounts of air were trapped at all because Titanic's stern was not built to be airtight like a submersible like Titan is. Watertight? Sure, but with hundreds and hundreds of avenues for air to escape if under pressure. There's this great little moment right at the end of the 1997 movie where the skylight cover over the steering room at the very stern of the ship explodes out as air is being pushed out of the ship by the water under extreme pressure. But there's even more compelling real-life footage that might show us what Titanic's stern looked like as it went down. In 1991, the Oceanos, a cruise ship and former ocean liner, suffered flooding and she sank. In the final moments, the stern rose vertically and began to slip below, and huge amounts of air and spray erupted from the structure as it went. Right at the end, you can see this cloud of dark, dusty air that's like 40 years worth of gathered dust forced out of the ship by the sinking. It's amazing stuff. So, if it wasn't an implosion, what on earth ripped the stern section apart like that? Well, to get an understanding of this, let's take a look at the damage itself to see if there are any clues down there. Along one section of the stern, on the starboard side, the shell plating, the ship's skin, is almost entirely peeled off. The poop deck, the very stern deck, has been peeled up and folded over onto itself like a tin can. Whole sections of the ship's hull around the breakup zone have been torn off, almost intact, and dumped on the ocean floor. The stern section's decks have then collapsed down on one another. Nowadays, the stern's actually no higher than the height of the engines, which were originally deep down in the ship's bowels. An implosion wasn't necessary to achieve this. What we're seeing is most likely a testament to the destructive forces of water itself. Hydrodynamics is a really interesting field of engineering. It explains to us why things like ships and submarines move more efficiently and smoother through the water. A simple kind of reductive explainer tells us that a streamlined object will move smoothly through the water because it doesn't create resistance or drag thanks to its shape. But an object with a large, flat, uneven surface will catch the water as it goes and create lots of drag. Now that puts large force on the structure itself. Titanic's bow, when it sank, was facing the way it was designed to face, forward. It fell forward, it went down through the water to hit the ocean floor, facing forward, and of course it was designed with hydrodynamics in mind, to cut through the ocean like a knife. Simple. It did that when it sank. Now the stern was designed hydrodynamically too, but only if it was heading in the right direction. As the stern section sank down, weighted at its forward end by the 1,300 or so tons of engine, it was going in completely the wrong direction, and opened up to the ocean was a 10-story tall, nearly 100-foot wide, jagged maw of torn and twisted metal, just ideal for creating drag. Now, the scale of these physics is really hard to comprehend. When you take my drawing here of the broken stern section and add a human for scale, you start to understand why. But let's try to imagine what the stern might have gone through as it sank. In the final plunge, water is roaring through the stern at an immensely rapid pace, and the air is being forced out at the same speed. Windows shatter as air surges through. Open portholes roar as all the air inside is being forced out. Inside, the ocean tears through the staterooms and public rooms like an unstoppable tidal wave, a battering ram of boiling white water that shreds everything in its path with devastating force. It leaves the interior of the ship an unrecognizable, empty mess because everything has been flattened by the sheer destructive weight of this almost tsunami of water as it was being swept through. With the air forced out and the interior flattened, the stern begins to drop for the sea floor, but upset in its path because of the weird shape of the breakup. Weakened sections, like the area just behind the third funnel, are torn off in their entirety as the 20,000-ton stern sinks through the water at speeds of somewhere between 10 and 20 knots, spinning as it does. Any structure attached to the stern that's not hydrodynamically streamlined sticks out and creates huge drag. With massive forces then acting on that structure, it simply breaks off. The stern probably twisted as it sank down, exerting forces all over. Exposed shell plating is being ripped and torn off like an old band-aid. Deck houses are flattened, the decks themselves pancake down, and to top it all off, the stern, itself larger in tonnage than the ocean liner RMS Seadric, and longer than the SS Adriatic of 1857, slams into the sea floor with such awful force that the weakened decks collapse and it nearly flattens. We've already seen what a huge weight of water can do to a ship. Rogue waves have smashed superstructures in like they were made out of tin cans. On the Lusitania, the impact was so severe that a rogue wave squashed the bridge permanently back by a few inches. On the Michelangelo, the forward superstructure collapsed in entirely. On QE2, railings were bent like they were wet spaghetti. Now, that was just after a quick strike from a wave. Imagine that kind of force applied to Titanic's already weakened stern section for minutes on end as it fell. No implosion would be needed to cause this kind of damage. The destructive forces of water are already scary enough. What we're seeing is most likely the result of hydrodynamic forces at play on a structure never designed to deal with anything like that. And when you look at the damage itself, things torn off almost intact like cranes, and even whole sections of the hull, it makes a lot of sense. The water simply plucked them off bit by bit, taking the stern apart as it dropped down. You can see the telltale signs of this in a lot of places. The poop deck torn up and folded over itself as if being flattened down again by the stream of water surging over it. The plating here, around C deck at the ship's aft well deck, has been bent back by the force of water acting against it. Possibly even the engines themselves. At the breakup zone, 2 cylinders were ripped off, their bed plates, what they sat on, was snapped, and the columns on top were just torn away. Now, this could have happened during the breakup, sure, but given that the breakup happened further forward, at around the third funnel, it's also possible the exposed engines were just ripped off by the force of water as the stern swiveled and violently pivoted around towards the sea floor. The terrible state of the stern section actually has ramifications we're still seeing today. In essence, the stern is likely to rot and collapse much sooner than the bow section because of the way corrosion works. Underwater on wrecks, typically if a ship suffers damage during the sinking, then that is where the corrosion will happen the most, and that's why the stern is probably going to collapse much sooner than the bow. It can be seen demonstrated on ships sunk in wartime, for example, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts. Where that ship suffered shell hits and splinter damage, she's corroding the most. Titanic's stern has gone through much, much more than a few shell hits. The entire thing has been beaten like a giant piñata. It means it's now collapsed down to a pathetic height, a shadow of its former glory. While the bow stands tall and proud and is eaten away from the breakup zone forward towards the very prow section, the stern is being eaten away all at once because literally everything is damaged. Soon, it will be gone almost completely. Thankfully, its state has been recorded in many ways, first by Ken's spectacular paintings, then by compelling close-up HD footage, and more recently by full 3D scans of the wreck. How long it will take for the stern section to actually collapse completely is beyond me, and to be honest with you, I'd hate to even throw an estimate out there. But for now, it tells us a story of destruction, and it gives us many clues as to the great ship's final moments.